right, you guys ready for the last session? Okay. So their question was, are you still going to be here for them? And the answer is yes, right? So very exciting talk today. We don't usually get talks from the real world, but these are two individuals who've been helping out doing some really significant work, managing data around kids, right? So you've all heard of UNICEF. We've got a couple of folks here. Karoline Hassfurter, is that close?
Yes,
okay.
very good.
Very good. She is the Communications and Knowledge Management Lead at UNICEF's Chief Data Office in there. So who knew UNICEF had a Chief Data Office before this one? But by golly, I'm sure glad to hear that they do, right?
It's very recent, actually.
Absolutely. You're going to talk for a bit, and then Yves is going to take over?
Exactly.
And Yves is he's led data and tech systems in private and public sectors with a good deal of experience in the medical area.
As well, epidemiology.
Absolutely. As well as oh, sorry, I read it wrong. Yeah, fashion forecasting. I thought I was there. We almost did some work for one of them, too. It's a lot of fun up there in New York. But anyway, we'll let these guys get started here, and thank you guys for sticking around.
Good. Well, thank you, each and every single one of you, for making it to the last session of today. I'm really grateful. And we are going to talk about our ability to leverage data to drive results for children. And we divided the presentation up to some extent, so I'll set the stage, and then Yves will talk about some exciting use cases. And we'll have 10 minutes for questions too, hopefully. So just a few quick words about us. My name is Karoline Hassfurter. I've been with UNICEF for about 10 years. My background is in marketing, in audience development, and in communications. And you want to say a couple words about yourself?
Yves, Jaques, I run the Frontier Data and Tech Unit. I'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by frontier data later on. But really, we sit at the nexus between users on one side, technologists on the other, to try and bridge those gaps.
And in terms of data communication, what that means in our world, it is really about getting data about children into the right hands. Usually that's decision makers in countries at the right moment, so that we influence governments or we target our programs better. So very quickly, who is UNICEF? I think maybe some of you know us from trick-or-treating for Halloween. We in headquarters are actually not so much engaged in fundraising. That's done by our national committee. But we work in working with our country offices to drive results and implement programs. We are the premier agency for humanitarian and development aid for children, and our work is guided by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most widely ratified treaty on international human rights in history. So imagine a world in which every child's rights is upheld and every child's voice is heard. Children don't have a lot of natural advocates. We are on the ground. We have local presence in 190 countries. Even in places like North Korea or in Afghanistan, where our presence is still actually quite extensive. In 2022, just to give you an idea of the scale of our work, we touched about 350 million lives of children with programs against malnutrition. We also delivered learning materials to over 28 million children. And a lot of that work has to do with data, because this data that we work with makes things that are not seen necessarily visible to governments, and then communities or partners can drive action. For example, in the area of disability. So how do countries measure disability? Do they even have a standard, or is it maybe stigmatized? Right? So we might work for them and then see, well, actually the disability rate in a country is not 0.5%, it's actually 6%. And then we can go to a country and say, well, this is actually worth implementing programs for. And this is a lot of our change strategy. We also work with a lot of data when it comes to procurement. So I think there was a session on immunization earlier. One of the examples that I find quite impressive myself is that we delivered on an annual level over 2 billion vaccines to children worldwide, and that's just routine immunizations. We had a major role in the COVAX rollout, And here's a few other results in that field. We are also very active as a humanitarian aid agency in natural disasters before, during, and after, and of course in human-made conflict as well. So right now, very active in Ukraine, but also in the Sahel, Horn of Africa, and so on. It's really tough work for my colleagues. And all of that, and I think this is really important, is that we try to elevate the voices of children and of youth. So we engage, and I don't mean reach, because our reach is even broader, but we really work with children to invite them to events, to speak at the UN, to governments and presidents, and to even engage in our data collection efforts in their communities. So last year we engaged, I think, 6 million in communications, 7.5 million in advocacy campaigns actively, and over 27 million on social media and online campaigns, platforms. So I don't know if the Sustainable Development Goals mean something to you. Maybe I can do a very quick show of hands. Who has heard of the Sustainable Development Goals? All right, great. It's actually half the room, I think. For those that haven't heard much about it, it's the quite aspirational call of action of the UN. It's a 17-point plan with 17 goals to have a more prosperous, just, and sustainable and peaceful world. And governments have come together to align around these goals. And in the world of data, that means they have also agreed on targets. I think it's 169 targets that then break down into 232 indicators. And that matters not just for us in the development world, but or for all of us that have children or care about children, but it really does matter for businesses too, because it means that that markets are robust, that consumers are empowered, and it's a sustainable world. And as I said, data is actually the lifeblood of this, and we use it to measure progress. So our country's progressing. We use data to inform decisions. You know, where do we need to target? Who's falling behind? You know, some of it is maybe shaming and naming and making lists and driving that home in conferences and speaking opportunities, and that's the accountability piece. That also comes with quite a bit of backlash sometimes that I'll talk about as well. So here's a quick example. My work entails bringing data out to the world. So yesterday, we launched immunization coverage updates. So thousands of data points, subnational, national, and global on immunization coverage. So we work with governments. In this case, I know it's very hard to see. I think it's Pakistan. It's DTP coverage, so diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. DTP3, it's standard, and you can see that you know, apart from having like a subnational view where children are vaccinated or not, we can see that Pakistan actually made tremendous progress in the last 5 years. And here's a little COVID dip in the second charts, but has caught up now in terms of the DTP coverage rate again. But there's still a few zero-dose children, and then having that even more granular helps us to then work with the communities and the government to hopefully get to no child that's unvaccinated and can survive. We have quite a few challenges. I think maybe some of them are similar, but some are also, I guess, quite diverse. So we actually have very little data about these Sustainable Development Goals. And in some areas more, like vaccinations, but in some areas like child protection, violence against children, for example, right? Who collects data on this voluntarily? Disability, mental health might be stigmatized. It doesn't exist. Also, data collection beyond household surveys is very, very expensive. So especially in low and middle income countries, there isn't much. And we really struggle to work with partners and improve that. Data timeliness and accuracy, because of this not very frequent data collection effort in household surveys, for example, it's hard to react quickly if there's an emergency or a humanitarian disaster. And the same with accuracy. There's a tech gap, there's a data science gap, of course. Now, a lot of the machine learning models are trained on Western data, they're trained on English-speaking cultures. Well, this is not necessarily where we're active or we want to be active. And there's more bias when we work with this kind of data also. And Yves has some great stories of how we are trying to overcome that. Politics is huge because we try to use our data to hold governments accountable, but it's not necessarily in everybody's interest, right? Maybe the malnutrition rate isn't where a government wants them to be, and they will try to hold back the release of it until after the elections. Well, but and that can really affect our ability then to work in this country because nevertheless, while sticking to the truth and using that as a leverage, we want to continue delivering our programs and implementing our campaigns and programs. Financial and human resources, yes, we are strained for cash, and that, of course, affects then the next piece. We are very pilot-driven still, especially when it comes to the area of frontier data and tech. We want to scale, but how? And the final challenge, I think, I mean, I've heard so much about it. How do we build culture? How do we build data savvy? How do we make sure that people use it naturally as part of their everyday culture, that all the decisions are evidence-based and it becomes part of our DNA? So with this in mind, only last year, we created the Chief Data Office, our boss. And Yves is going to talk a little bit more about this and tell us about some exciting use cases.
Thanks, Karoline. And one lesson learned, like never go after a communications person. But part of Karoline's job is also to kick me if I speak too much, because sometimes I do that. So I'll try and move quickly, keeping an eye on the time. So the Chief Data Office, we finally realized, I mean, you saw the challenges that was being pointed out by Karoline. So we realized we actually really needed a Chief Data Office so we could try and look at this more strategically, actually have a data strategy for the first time, and really, increase the way that data was being used to provide value to the agency. We've got 3 different groups within the Chief Data Office. Karoline leading on data communication, I lead on frontier data and technology, and then we have a data governance and strategy unit. And the data governance and strategy unit has naturally been leading on the UNICEF data strategy, which actually devolves from the UN data strategy. So we kind of authorized our work by really taking work that's already being done for the entire umbrella UN. It's got 3 basic parts to it. This is going to look familiar to a lot of you. We've, very use case based, use cases organized in portfolios. The way we organize those portfolios might be different from the private sector in a way. We're not trying to have data support a business strategy, rather support our strategic priorities, so slightly different language. But for example, we have strategic priorities in certain thematic areas, let's say nutrition, like Karoline mentioned before, so a portfolio on nutrition. At the same time, a use case might also find itself in a regional portfolio, for example, the Sahel Belt in sub-Saharan Africa. So we got this portfolio approach with use cases. Then we have both capabilities and enablers. So capabilities are things that we know how to do, analytics, AI, data management, and so on. Then finally, enablers are these communities of practice, people, data governance, partnerships, so that we can actually enable over our use cases and our capabilities. So these are kind of the 3 pieces that we're pulling together so that we can really achieve a world in which data are used to realize children's rights instead of being used to erode children's rights, which we often find to be the case. And that takes me to responsible data for children. This has been an ongoing initiative that actually predates the Chief Data Officer's section, but that we've pulled very strongly into our work. And it's a partnership with GovLab from New York University. And what we've realized a lot of times is, we don't call it governance because people don't like the word governance. So we talk about responsible data. But we also talk about responsible data because it's an enabling mechanism. What we find is a lot of our users are actually afraid to use data that they could maybe use because they're precisely concerned about the privacy or ethical implications of the data, particularly with respect to children who don't typically have any legal agency over their data. So what we're doing is really creating an enabling environment in which we have the appropriate data sets, appropriate technology and tools and policies in place so the users are actually comfortable using the data. So this was touched on in an earlier session that I was in. I very much agree. Looking at governance as an enabling mechanism instead of as something that gets in people's way. We all talk a lot about shadow IT. There's a lot of shadow data going on too. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen. I just want to quickly show how combination of a use case, capability, and enabler can generate impact. So one of our challenges that we've realized is just so serious is really the gap between the data and tech capacity in the private sector and what we have in the humanitarian and development ecosystem. They're just really far apart. Technologists have no idea what's going on in the development sector. And a lot of times in the development sector, people just have no idea what's going on in the technology sector. So how do we close that gap so that both sides can learn more about each other and we can deliver more effectively? This shows kind of some of the uncertainty that we have. What we have along the right side here, we have crises happening at larger and larger scale, more and more frequently. People need timely insights. They need high-resolution insights. And frankly, we struggle to deliver on those. If you look in the lower left corner here, where we have low domain uncertainty and low tech uncertainty, that's where we've got HHS, that's shorthand for household surveys, which pretty much means gathering data like the Romans did in the time of Mary and Joseph. We knock on people's doors, we say, hey, how many people live here? Are there any children? Do they go to school? It's a great way to get information, but it's slow, it's expensive, and it doesn't really meet a lot of these fast-breaking needs that we have. As we go towards the upper right there, we're getting into more technological uncertainty and more domain uncertainty. And so those are the directions where we're struggling to push. That's why we call it frontier data and technology. It's the frontiers for us at UNICEF. What are the frontiers and boundaries that we're trying to push at? Well, that's going from the bottom left to the upper right here. And what we were is really lacking a vehicle to do that. So the solution that we've been putting in place in the last couple of years is what we call the Frontier Data Network. So it's where we put a few different things together. Talent, we're always looking for more data science and engineering talent in general. Appropriate technology so that we can deliver on that. And then of course the underlying data, which often we might not have ourselves. We have to get it from the private sector or other actors. And then of course funding. When we put those together, then we're actually building frontier data capacity. And that's what we've been finally doing in a cohesive way over the last couple of years. It consists of two different chunks. We've got Frontier Data Connect, which is our global-facing part. That's where we do things like build partnerships with academia and research. It's where we connect with private sector to get access to big data assets. And so that's our global-facing kind of coordinating part. But we also very much want to get away from this narrative with people with problems over here and people with solutions over here. We want to bring those two together. And that's what the nodes are about. The nodes are about pairing local talent, local challenges to build local solutions. We've started our first node we built in our East Asia Pacific region over the last couple of years. That's been quite successful. And then has acted as a way for a vehicle for us to advertise, which then got the Spanish government interested as of last year, who are now helping us build a second node in Latin America in Panama City. So we're using this kind of slow burn to get more resources and keep building organically. So it's very much an organic model. I want to give one quick use case of how this stuff sometimes works out when we get the parts right. Ukraine response, I think, was really quite interesting. We were realizing how behind we were on spatial data in general and how scattered our investments were. We had 60 different country offices with their own licenses of geospatial tools like ArcGIS or Carto. We had something like 125 customer numbers with Esri. So we started putting that together and having just one enterprise-grade platform. And so we had just got that into place in 2021. when the Ukraine war began, and we rapidly needed to understand how are we going to address heavy migration. We need to get supplies like school supplies to children. We need to get health supplies to families. And we need to do that really rapidly. Now, since we were putting this Frontier Data Network together, well, first off, on our geospatial platform, we already had 12 layers, which were quite helpful. Like, we knew where the schools were, we knew where preschools were, we knew where health facilities were. That came from historic work that we had done with the Ukraine government for completely other purposes. But we already had those in place, and we had the platforms that could deliver on it. But the community aspects of the Frontier Data Network is what allowed us then to start working with our emergency operations people, with our field offices, with the technology folks. We're a very scattered, globalized agency, but the Frontier Data Network gave us this community of practice that we could rapidly leverage to start getting this all in place so that people could start doing analytics over the top of it. And that led straight into then external collaboration with other UN agencies, so that we, within about 4 weeks, we went from the 12 layers we had to 28 layers, and some of them we're updating every few hours, using data sources that were internal data sources, external data sources. And it was just kind of an example of, having some platform kind of enablers, having capable staff who also had networks that they could draw on rapidly, and then having a community in place to help us really be able to put all the pieces together. And, oh, wrong button. There you go. And before I close here, I just want to say we're always looking for partners. I mentioned, that we have these 2 nodes. We're working actively with a number of universities, University of Toronto, University of Edinburgh, University of Saarland. We're working with ISI University in Torino. And we're looking to, and then, private sector partners. We work with Maxar for Earth observation data. We work with mobility companies like Cubic and Bodze who provide mobility data. We're always looking to expand those relationships. So, go back to your organizations if you think collaborating with us on Frontier Data could be of interest. We're really actively growing the network and looking for more partners. Great. So I don't know how many minutes we have left. We have some canned questions, but I'm rather interested to see if what questions you might have for us.
We have 5 minutes, yeah.
I think you guys should have brought around the little orange boxes. I think that would have been
The chicken feed boxes?
Everybody remembers it. Data, please?
Yeah, we've heard that one
You've
before.
heard that. I'm sure you have. Hang on, I think let's have one over here first. Chelsea.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gilles from MIT. My question is more related to your architecture for capturing that data. How do you use mobile data capture to have more up-to-date information? You mentioned Ukraine to have, up to the moment, if there's, I don't know, an attack somewhere and to come to the rescue. How do you interrelate with your emergency services?
That's a great question. So we've been, as I noted, catching up on our spatial data capabilities. So the first thing was to get one single ArcGIS enterprise platform going. At the same time, we're investing in open source Python-based components, which include both dashboards so that our users can easily create their own instances, but behind that also a dedicated spatial data catalog. And that's the part that keeps me interested, actually, which has APIs that will connect with our various systems, but is also designed to easily ingest data. We use Databricks as an analytics platform, and also we do quite a lot of scripting in there to push data into other formats. We think we have a long ways to go, and that's why with the Frontier Data Network, I was saying, we're always looking for talent and technology and data, really trying to center, I think, a little better on a shared kind of architecture and infrastructure would be helpful for us. Our users tend to be all over the roadmap, and within the community, we're starting to actually really talk to everyone. What are they using? Why are they using it? What are they missing? So that we can actually figure out what's going to be the best architecture and set of components for us to center on. Kind of as we've already been doing on the spatial data side, We need to do that more strongly on the data science side. And then a lot of data sets that we get, they come from our partners, as I was saying, like mobility data partners or Earth observation partners. So we don't typically do that collection ourselves. We're we have agreements in place with other providers that are enabling us to get those data sets. And we're just working with World Bank, who have the Data for Development Partnership, which they've already got sort of agreements designed with about 30 different providers, that by joining that partnership, you can kind of start borrowing those agreements and reducing the legal hassles quite a bit, because we find one of the biggest challenges is, somebody wants to let us use their data and we want to use it, but then it takes 2 years to hammer out a legal agreement to actually do it. I don't know if I've answered your question, but.
Partly, my question was more about the use of mobile technology to capture your data, not receiving from a third-party provider for your own data, the HHS that you were talking about.
Yeah. Well, the household survey stuff is, as it shows in that graph, pretty low-tech uncertainty, using classically used survey collection tools. Could be ODK-based tools, that are like Open Data Kit you might be familiar with. Some are also like CS Pro, which has come from USAID for many years for doing demographic and household surveys. Those are kind of the areas where we feel we can do the most work to actually improve how we do data collection.
We have U-Report also.
Pardon?
U-Report. So we
There's
engage, it's not so much in our team, but we engage young people and have them answer questions via phone. So that's not necessarily statistically representable, but it gives us their voice, it gives us some idea of before and after, and it lets us measure the temperature. And that I think we have in over 50 countries.
We've also worked with Meta, for example, to do campaigns. But a lot of the places where we have the most serious problems, we don't really have much social media penetration. So that's a challenge for us.
From a customer standpoint, right? The persona, the type of customers that you have, who would you say are your main customers? I couldn't help but be really confused by your different, your different partners and your this and your that and your responses. And so on a day-to-day basis, who would you say your main customers / users of your analysis and your data products, who are they?
Well, there's going to be several questions that maybe I'll answer the internal one, and then Karoline can maybe capture the external more. So like with what I was showing with respect to Ukraine, for example, so we were producing data on where Ukrainians were either internally displaced or externally displaced, so that we could best see where to put blue dot locations. Those are locations where we hand out things like school supplies or health supplies. So that's data that's very much being used by our emergency operations people, so that they can do things like figure out where to target aid. And so that's primarily where that kind of data gets used. Another way in which we were using the data, and just maybe slightly longer term, was collaborating with UNOCC. We had the information on where all the schools were, and we used like Maxar data to actually see which, the damage level to schools, so that we could then understand how could we maximize the spend on getting the most kids back with spending the least on fixing schools. So that was partly internally, but so the government could best understand which schools and where they should fix them. But then we have a lot of external data customers as well.
Yes, so part of my job is to manage data.unicef.org. And we have about 4 million users. We do some surveys on who they are. Sometimes we know, sometimes we are somewhat in the dark, but it's academia, it's students, of course, too. It is media, partners and advocates from other agencies, and civil society. And then we really, that's internal, external, we work with our country office staff. So we try to make our products, let's say there's a dashboard on immunization, we make it very specific for that country, we make it kind of flexible for their use so that then they can take it to their contacts, because this is really where most of the leverage is, right? They can go, if it's an education dashboard, filter what do they need, what kind of level of technical expertise do they have, and actually print it out and walk to the ministry. Right? So we, depending on where they are, we try to make it as, we're a very small team, applicable and usable for them, for our presence in 190 countries.
Wow.
Does that answer your question? It's hard.
190 countries. So unfortunately, we have to stop here because everybody wants to go drink.
Yes.
But remember, those are the back side of your tickets. So I want to thank both of these folks for coming up here, Karoline and Yves.
Thank you.